An important part of Operation Overlord was the setting up of artificial harbours on beaches in Normandy. These Mulberry and Gooseberry harbours, as they were known, were intended to function from the second week after D-Day until Cherbourg was liberated, enabling troop reinforcements and equipment to be landed in France. They would also be used to embark the wounded and prisoners of war for England. Southampton played a leading role in the construction of the harbour components. 2 Mulberry harbours were planned and the prefabricated parts were towed across the channel in the days following D-Day.
The engineer's job ashore was nearly finished, and the floating causeways stretched far out into the harbour. The first pier head, which, like all the other sections, had made the slow and hazardous journey across the channel, was now brought into position.
The Mulberry at Arromanches was for the use of the British forces, that at Utah Beach for the Americans. However, a storm which began on June 19 and lasted for 3 days, destroyed the Utah Beach harbour. The harbour at Arromanches, although damaged by the storm, played an important role. The Gooseberry harbours were formed by sunken blockships on other beaches. The Mulberry harbours were largely of British design and construction, and represented a major feat for civil engineering. Construction of the Mulberries began in late 1943, against a background of acute labour and material shortages. The Mulberries were composed of several elements, each with its own code name, and the whole project was highly secret. Phoenixes were huge, hollow, reinforced concrete caissons designed to provide the main breakwater or harbour wall. In total, 213 of these were built. 12 of the largest caissons, each the size of a block of low-rise flats, were built in Southampton in the No. 5 dry dock, in the older eastern docks. The dry dock was 800 feet long and would hold 3 caissons at a time and completed in wet berths. Initially 500 workers were employed in 2 12-hour shifts, but eventually well over 1,000 workers were employed on the large caissons alone. In April and May 1944, a further 5 smaller caissons, partially constructed in nearby coastal areas, including Bewley and Leap, were completed in Southampton's inner dock. Bombardons were long steel structures intended to form an outer floating breakwater for larger ships, but were not a success.
A floating breakwater was laid further out to sea to provide a deep water anchorage for the bigger ships. It was an experimental contrivance which hadn't been tested in heavy weather.
They were built in No. 7 dry dock, the King George V graving dock near Millbrook and on adjacent quays and land. Work on these began in February 1944 and continued until May 13 with parts from all over the country. Whales were unloading facilities composed of floating pierheads and roadways. The steel pontoons forming pierheads were fitted with vertical steel columns, or spuds, which anchored the pierhead to the seabed. Floating roadways linked the pierheads to the shore. These roadways were composed of articulated steel sections which rested on concrete or steel floats called beetles. Steel erection tanks were also fitted. The whales could move up and down with the tide. Spud columns were made on land near the No. 7 dry dock. The pierhead pontoons were towed to Southampton from other parts of the country and soldiers fitted the spuds to the pierheads.
With further pierheads linked to it, a great wharf would be formed where vessels could unload directly into lorries which would drive to and fro along the floating causeways. By D+13, only 12 days after the first ship was sunk, the huge task of making the port was nearly done. The inner breakwater was more than half completed. All the floating breakwaters were laid. 1 pier finished, 3/4 of a mile of it, with 3 of the projected line of pierheads at its seaward end. To meet this line, a 2nd pier was under construction. To the west was a 3rd pier. This had a pierhead designed for unloading tank landing ships.
In April 1944, between 200 and 300 skilled workers were drafted into Southampton to complete the pierheads. 2 wet berths were provided, with additional power supply and equipment, and work continued day and night. The steel units for the floating roadways were brought by road and rail to Southampton and assembled by Royal Engineers at the Marchwood Military Port. In early 1944, 39 sets of pontoons were completed near No. 7 Dry Dock by the Royal Engineers. On completion, the caissons were parked off Selsey Bill and Dungeness until required. Due to a shortage of mooring tackle, it was decided to sink and later refloat them. However, many unforeseen problems were encountered concerning the refloating. The caissons at Selsey became stuck in the muddy seabed, and by mid-April the crisis was so serious as to threaten to wreck the entire project. One caisson being towed to Selsey went aground near Littlehampton and was not refloated for 10 days. To refloat the caissons, every salvage vessel in the country was requisitioned. The problems were not finally resolved until June 2nd, and in the event only 3 caissons were lost.
In an ever-increasing flood, the vehicles and supplies poured through it in calm weather and rough. We had beaten the weather, and Hitler had lost yet another ally. Lorries, jeeps, ambulances, tanks, they rolled ashore along the causeway, down the roads which the engineers had built.